No mention from the Prime Minister, perhaps unsurprisingly, about his U-turn this morning, but I thought it was interesting. Rishi Sunak put out a tweet a little bit earlier saying that even the sense that there's one rule for the government or for some and another rule for the rest of us was wrong, an acknowledgement that they didn't get it right straight away on this. Why does it always go through this difficult process for the government?
I wish I knew the answer to that question, Isabel. I think there's one thing we know about Twitter, is that Twitter never agrees. Twitter is the place where people argue and say, you're wrong, you're stupid, you know, the sort of thing that we all read on Twitter. But today, when I woke up and sort of turned on Twitter for the reaction to the first suggestion from numbers 10 and 11 Downing Street that they wouldn't self-isolate it, Twitter was united, unprecedented. Everybody on left and right, lockdown skeptics, lockdown enthusiasts, all were of one mind. You can't, whatever your position, politically or on COVID, you cannot have the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the government telling the nation one thing and doing another. I know we've heard that expression repeatedly, but it is that simple. And the fact that the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and his aides didn't understand that does suggest to me that there is something fundamentally awry inside the heart of our government at the moment.
And Tim, I want to ask you a little bit about the pilot that initially they were claiming that they were going to be part of. A little bit convenient that they were able to suddenly opt into it, something that, you know, lots of people would love to do. And then quite interesting hearing Robert Jenrick later on this morning explaining this pilot and the organisations that were involved. And he mentioned the Transport for London were part of this pilot as well. They've subsequently come out and said this is news to them. They didn't know they were part of the pilot. All a bit shambolic from the centre on this.
A bit shambolic, Isabel, or very, very shambolic. Look, the Transport for London example is, a big deal thing. There are lots of commuters in London at the moment who are being inconvenienced because certain lines are being closed wholly or in part. And so for their commutes to work or to see family or to just go home for medical appointments or whatever, are being disrupted. And so to suggest that somehow TfL was part of a scheme that actually it's not benefiting from, certainly not at least yet, just suggested that this whole argument that the Prime Minister and Chancellor initially tried to make, that they were part of a pilot scheme, even that was rushed. It didn't seem to hold water for people. So, if you're going to have an excuse for not doing something people think that you should be doing, at least make sure the excuse is robust. I think the government's really on the edge at the moment. It's probably past the edge for lots of your viewers, but I think a lot of people are beginning to worry about the basic competence of this administration. Competence has always been the thing that explains why Conservative governments generally are elected more regularly than Labour governments. If the Conservative Party loses its reputation for competence, and for some people it already will have done so, it's in big, big, big trouble.
Tim, there's this idea that he seems to be his own chief of staff at the moment and he's making all the decisions himself and he doesn't have anyone guiding him. Is that the case?
Well, I hesitate to say this, but I wonder whether he is his chief of staff. I wonder whether Mrs. Johnson is playing quite a role in this as well. The stories that I hear from people who are relatively well informed, or should be pretty well informed about what's going on inside Downing Street, do say that Carrie Johnson, the Prime Minister's wife of recent marriage, is certainly calling a lot of the shots. People she don't get preferment, and people that she does like do get preferment. She certainly has some influence on policy, and I think she, of course, has a political background. She was a senior communications advisor for the Conservative Party before she began her relationship with the Prime Minister. And I think her influence is very, very considerable. And some people think it is a very negative influence, others are less sure. But there is certainly a lack of structure, a lack of clear chains of command, and Downing Street's decision-making process is certainly suspect whoever is truly behind those decisions.
Okay, quite aside from the U-turn and whoever might be influencing them, I was reading today that Tony Blair can't resist picking up the phone to Boris Johnson from across the political divide to give his advice. In fact, he says he thinks the Prime Minister shouldn't be isolating. Do you think it's a good policy, this isolation? You know, we've got the case, haven't we, of Sajid Javid double vaxxed and yet still testing positive. So, you know, we need to make sure we're not allowing this virus to get out of control. But surely the idea of this pilot is actually very, very good, that people should be pinged and then take a test, and that would make sense.
I completely agree with what you just said, Isabel. I think the whole idea that people have been double vaxxed, who are taking tests that show that they don't have COVID, the fact that they have to isolate is not just bad for, in this case, for the governance of the country to have the Prime Minister and the Chancellor sort of less removed from their desks in a normal way. But we have, you know, the stories in the last few days of Nissan potentially having shortages in its own labour force so that it can't deliver cars on time. I think today we've read stories about the supermarket chain Marks and Spencer having very serious shortages in their own workforce, which may mean they have to cut opening hours simply because they can't keep their stores open and in the normal way. This policy is mad. But what you can't have, if the government are going to insist on having this policy, they too have to abide by it. If it's got rid of for everyone, fair enough. You can't get rid of it just for a few people at the top of government. That just feeds the whole idea that the Conservative Party is a party for the rich, the powerful and the well-connected rather than for the ordinary person, which I truly believe the Conservative Party is. But it's not doing a very good job at showing that at the moment.
You mentioned Twitter was united. Now it's probably the hottest day of the year. Do you think he's going to get away with it? Him and Rishi will get away with it simply because most people are at the park or at the beach today and they don't really care what's going on?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm in a slightly sort of a summary outfit for you today. You look much more grown up in the studio there, but at least you have air conditioning. Yeah, look, I don't know, actually. I think people will notice it. I think a general sort of episode of incompetence in the normal scheme of things, voters might not notice it. But we're living in a time, of course, because of the pandemic, when the government's regulations, the way they are regulating the pandemic has enormous consequences for all of us. And so I fear, from the Conservative government's point of view, a lot of people will notice this, even if they are at the beach or at a barbecue for a large part of the day. And of course, if it was just the first example where it had looked like the government was saying one thing and doing another, the British people are forgiving. They're lenient. They'll be gracious towards people who make just one or two mistakes. But these mistakes are beginning to pile up. And the government really should be very, very, very much more cautious about how it handles its reputation in public.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.